Department of Education. I work coordinating all the youth workers in our high school, so I work with any young person who's at risk of disengaging from school. In my role, I do lots of work with teachers doing professional teacher development, looking at the impact of trauma and neglect and abuse on brain development in young people and how that has a role in the classroom. So I work with teachers to develop strategies to actually improve the learning outcomes for young people who have learning difficulties as well. And Story Dogs is really effective to work with 7 to 8-year-old young or children in a primary school setting. I think it's most effective because the young people who are picked up in early primary and then given remedial reading support and one-to-one training, they've really missed the mark if they get to be in year 3 or 4 at about a 7 or 8-year-old level, and they're no longer able to get that direct support and commitment of funding for them. So something like Story Dogs really picks up that cohort that otherwise would be missed for the rest of their education. If you can't read properly, you can't do chemistry, you can't do math, you can't pass your certificate 3 in carpentry, building, engineering, this sort of stuff. So literacy itself is absolutely critical, and the earlier you can pick up those skills, the better it is. So to pick up a group in around the 7, 8-year-old mark and be able to work with them to develop those literacy skills is really critical. The young people that fall out of high school, especially the year 8, 9 and 10 group, and they're predominantly boys, and they're predominantly boys who don't have strong academic records, they fall out because school just becomes too difficult by the time they get into secondary phase. So any young person who has a difficulty reading in a classroom setting has a couple of things that are going on for them that really exacerbate the learning difficulty. The first one is that their self-image as a learner will be really poor. The young people from about kindergarten start to compare themselves with other students and they decide they're dumb. And when a young person's decided that they're dumb, they're sitting in a classroom setting and the entire classroom setting is a really humiliating experience for them. If that's the case, once you've set an image of yourself as a dumb student or a bright student, then you step up to that, and that's actually how you take your risks. So every time you learn something new, or every time you speak out in front of the class or you read aloud, you're actually taking a really big risk, because it can be potentially really humiliating for a student in a classroom to not be able to keep up with their peers. So when you do one-to-one reading and you're with a teacher or when you're with an adult, the focus is still on you as the reader and your performance. The difference with working with an animal is that the animal is not going to judge you. The animal is just unconditionally accepting your presence and the fact that you want to be with it and that you're paying it attention, and it's happy with that. So the stress response for a young person with a learning difficulty working with an animal is really, really different to a young person working with a teacher. Even if the teacher is very kind and loving and accepting, that relationship is always a little bit loaded for the young person who's already decided that they've got a problem. A learning difficulty is really often associated with a young person who has high stress levels as well. So the higher the stress level, the more it will trigger your learning difficulty. If you go into a stress response in a classroom, you'll start to produce adrenaline and possibly cortisol if there's an ongoing stress response. And that will start to actually impact on the connection, the synaptic connection in the brain. So when you're looking for memory or when you're looking to create new memories of the things that you're learning, if you're producing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, it will actually impede that process. If you're producing a lot of dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter in the brain that makes us all curious and excitable and happy to do things, then you're actually going to be facilitating new neural synapse connections. And that's the kind of environment we want kids to be learning in. So that's why playing and having a really good time with your peers and your teachers is a really effective way to learn things. It lowers the stress level, it makes a young person more open to the learning process, and that's where the dogs come in, and I think that's why it's so powerful. So for a young person who, especially if they've got a trauma background or a neglect or abuse background, they become hypersensitive to stress in the classroom. It's almost like they're waiting for an opportunity to be humiliated. It makes them more reticent to step forward and really take the risk to learn, and it also makes them a little bit more inclined, if they've got any learning difficulties or stresses in the system that could impede their concentration, that'll be heightened as well. program like Story Dogs is really effective. There are other programs too that have an impact in a similar way, but I think Story Dogs has some really distinct advantages when it's working in a classroom. I think the presence of an animal just relaxes the students enormously, and it makes the reading process a really joyful experience. It's no longer a high-stress experience where you could potentially fail. It's you're telling the dog a story, you're entertaining somebody else, you're entertaining somebody else who's not going to judge your entertainment or your reading capacity as inadequate. So it's a really supportive environment. I really love the fact that it's volunteers going into schools to deliver the program as well. I think that a volunteer goes into a school with a really pure intention to support the students. In our classrooms, we may have up to 28 students in a classroom with one teacher, and possibly teachers' aides as well, but the individual attention that a young person can get from a non-academic staff member, I think, is really good for their soul, it's good for their learning experience, it's good for their personal development as well. I'm particularly interested in young people who have experienced trauma and neglect and abuse, and for those young people, especially at the critical age of 7 and 8, where so many of their conscious responses to what's happening to them at home start to come to the surface. I think it's a really, really nice time to have the interaction with the dog, both academically and personally. When a young person has an experience of stress, what they do is they go into a fight-flight response. And in that fight-flight response, adrenaline will be produced through the body. So the limbic part of the brain, the central part of the emotional part of the brain, is a bit like the smoke detector, and that'll set off a stress response. And the young person then is locating the majority of their brain activity back in the brain stem. And I say to the kids that the brain stem is the earthworm part of the brain. It doesn't do any high scholastic thinking, it just does survival. And how am I going to get through this? And am I going to fight for my way out, or am I going to flee? So if a young person's operating from the brainstem part of their brain when they're in a classroom setting, there's no opportunity for them to do conscious thinking and reasoning and to actually come up with higher learning. It's just really a survival mechanism. And that's where a lot of our reactive behaviours and things come from as well. But if the young person's with the dog and the volunteer and they're really, really relaxed and they're feeling happy, they're going to move out of that brainstem, come back into their frontal lobes, into the cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain, and then they can start to process the material and be really actively learning in a really positive way. So it's really taking the stress mechanism out of the equation of learning and putting the play back into it as well. I think a program like Story Dogs it's a priceless contribution to a classroom setting. It makes the classroom a more holistic learning experience for young people as well. We have a very strong push at the moment on outcomes and accountability and results, and that has a place and it's really important. But it's also really important to remember that every learner as an individual student has different learning needs, and I think that Story Dogs helps to fulfill some of the learning needs that it's very difficult for a teacher to address when you have 28 students in a classroom. And there's an element of rigour and time management and delivery that some of our some of our students who experience greater challenge in learning, I think the Story Dogs program really helps to perhaps make the whole learning process a positive thing as well. So for the first time, learning itself can become positive, and they can take that back into the classroom and start to use it when they're learning other subjects and they're doing other things as well. So I think something like Story Dogs is really, really valuable, and I think it makes a very valuable contribution to a primary school environment. The other thing I think it does too is I think it brings a lot more fun into a primary school environment, and I think it's very healthy to have well-trained, obedient dogs around children. I think it's very good for them, and it's good for breaking down fears about animals as well, and it's good for supporting the learning process, and that supports staff too. The science behind why there are such strong outcomes with animal-assisted therapies and also animal-assisted learning programs isn't 100% clear yet. We're not quite sure what the mechanisms are that make this such an effective way to work with young people and with people who've got difficulties. Equine-assisted therapies have really strong outcomes, and also things like reading dogs and dog assistance programs and other aspects of learning do really well. I would suggest it's definitely the relationship between the animal and the human being is one of trust, and it's a different relationship to that between a human being and a human being. And if the stress response in a young person is easily triggered by human interaction, if they have a nice relationship with the animal, if the animal is not a frightening animal in any way, that perhaps opens up parts of them that otherwise would be in a defence position. So I would suggest that the decrease in the stress response certainly would improve the learning experience for any young person. It's a very positive thing. Programs like Story Dogs are so critically important in our education system. We're moving more and more to a standardised approach to education where we treat all our learners as the same. And we're looking at there's a constant sense of comparison in the classroom. Either it's an informal comparison made between the students themselves, or it's a comparison made through testing. Something like Story Dogs takes the learning process itself out of that comparison mode, and it makes it a really enjoyable experience. And learning itself should be a really enjoyable experience because that's the foundation of our entire lives. We never ever stop learning. And I work with lots of teenagers and adults who have had that learning process almost in a way contaminated in the primary school environment, and it's really limited what they feel they're able to achieve for the rest of their lives. So if a young person can spend time in a Story Dog situation and really start to develop a love for reading and a love for the exploration of something that's new and of sharing that knowledge with somebody else as well, even if it is a dog, it's a great start. If they can develop those core skills, they're skills that they'll take all the way through the rest of their education and through the rest of their lives. So programs like Story Dogs, any program that encourages young people to love learning and be calm and relaxed in the classroom and to really enjoy sharing their knowledge with other people, I think is an incredible contribution, not just to the school or the individual child, but to the community as a whole.